collapse of the Roman Empire in the year 476 AD, brought about by the relentless invasions of barbarian tribes, ended a magnificent civilization that had dominated Europe for almost 10 centuries. And with this collapse, a new chapter of European history called the Dark Ages began, that was to last almost 600 years. They were called the Dark Ages because during this era, the previous advances of civilization were reversed. A single unified European government was replaced by scores of small warring kingdoms. Roman cities and roads fell into ruin and disrepair, and the skills that had brought about Rome's great achievements in learning and art were lost. Now let us discover what happened in one small corner of the Roman Empire with the coming of the Dark Ages. Much of the modern country of Great Britain was once ruled from Rome, where it was known as the province of Britannia. When the Roman troops first arrived in Britain in the middle of the 1st century AD, it was a sparsely populated land inhabited by Celtic-speaking tribes called the Britons. Few traces remain of the ancient culture of the Britons, but mysterious stone circles, like the one seen here, are believed to have once been used by them as places of religious worship. As they had done elsewhere in Europe, the Romans brought civilization and rule by law to the native people of their new province. They introduced the Britons to the Roman religion with its bewildering array of gods and goddesses. And quite soon, the Romans began to construct towns whose new buildings mimicked the magnificent structures of their great capital city of Rome. Each new town had large public baths and markets, and was provided with paved streets, clean running water, and excellent systems for drainage and public sanitation. And so it was that the Romans introduced a highly advanced culture to Britain, which became the northernmost outpost of Rome's vast empire. However, as time went by, the Roman Empire was increasingly subjected to attacks by outsiders, whom the Romans called barbarians, a word which in Latin means foreigners. Most of these barbarians came from the northern regions of Europe. They were poor farmers, organized into tribes headed by powerful warrior chieftains. The barbarians envied the wealth of Rome and the rich lands she possessed, and so they carried out violent attacks to destroy the powerful Roman army. In a very early attempt to keep the barbarians out of his empire, the Emperor Hadrian ordered that this stone wall was to be constructed entirely across the northern frontier of Britain. And for quite some time, Hadrian's Great Wall seemed to serve its purpose, for by the year 325 AD, nearly 200 years after the wall had been constructed, Roman Britain had experienced centuries of uninterrupted peace and prosperity, and by then possessed 4 cities with populations exceeding 15,000. But right around this time, big changes were taking place all across Europe. Christianity was adopted as Rome's official religion. And 7 decades later, in response to increasing assaults by the barbarians, the Roman Empire was permanently divided into eastern and western halves, each half being ruled by a separate emperor. As the ferocity of the barbarian attacks increased, Roman troops began to be withdrawn from Britain to help her defend her besieged provinces to the south. But in the year 410 AD, the great city of Rome itself was plundered by a tribe called the Visigoths. The capital lay in ruins, and the desperate emperor sent word to the citizens of Britannia that he could no longer provide for their defense. So at that point, the Roman province of Britannia ceased to exist. After the year 410, without the presence of Roman troops, Britain became an easy target for the Germanic tribes from across the North Sea, and soon the barbarian invasions of Britain began in earnest. Tribesmen called the Angles sailed out from the southern side of the Danish peninsula and occupied the northeastern part of Britain. Another tribe, the Saxons, set forth from their impoverished villages in Saxony on the coastal plain of the North Sea and occupied much of southern Britain. The Jutes began their raids from the part of the Danish peninsula called Jutland and occupied other areas of land in the south of Britain separate from the Saxons. Finally, one other tribe, the Frisians, sailed to Britain from their homeland in Frisia, just to the south of Saxony, and became dispersed as a distinct group in the years that followed. These four tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians, have been lumped together by historians into a single group called the Anglo-Saxons. As the powerful Anglo-Saxon chieftains drove the native Britons toward the west, they set up separate kingdoms in a land that had known only unified Roman rule for almost 400 years. For the next few centuries, Anglo-Saxon settlers from across the North Sea built hundreds of new villages, many of them highly fortified, using the same materials and techniques they had used back in their homelands. And these new settlements made of wood bore little resemblance to the Roman towns they had destroyed. And so, by stages that can hardly be traced, the culturally advanced, well-ordered Roman world was completely transformed by the Anglo-Saxons. Now let us take a closer look at how these Anglo-Saxons lived. Construction of this village, called Stoa, first began around 420 AD, about 10 years after the Romans pulled out of Britain. Stoa is located in central Britain, only about 30 miles from the North Sea. And by the time the Anglo-Saxons arrived here, this land had already been under cultivation by the Romans for several centuries. Stoa, like other Anglo-Saxon communities, was basically self-sufficient for most things, from food to clothing to household goods. For in the earliest days of their occupation of Britain, the Anglo-Saxons did not engage in the high level of trade that had centered in Roman towns and markets. And the same held true of religion, for the Anglo-Saxons followed the Old Norse gods and had little knowledge of either the pagan Roman religion or Christianity. Stoa was a typical 5th century Anglo-Saxon community and was home to 3 or 4 different family groups, which included not just parents and their children, but could also include grandparents and great-grandparents as well. Within the village boundaries, each family group occupied its own mini-village consisting of 5 or 6 buildings. These buildings were always roofed with a thatch of straw or reeds to keep out the rain. The walls were made either of wooden planks or woven branches and mud, called daub and wattle. And this technique of weaving branches also was put into use in creating baskets for storing grains and wool. This building, called the hall, was the focal point of activity for the whole village, and here a fire was always kept burning, both for warmth and to cook food. The hall tended to be a pretty smoky place, for it had no chimney, so the smoke simply filtered up through the thatched roof into the outside air. Families gathered together here in the evenings or during bad weather to relax, share their evening meal, and the day's gossip. The outbuildings served many functions. Some were used for sleeping, others served as workshops for various crafts, such as making shoes from leather, or making pots, jugs, cups, and other containers from clay. But the main activity of the village of Stoa was farming. Wheat, barley, and peas were raised, and these crops provided the vast majority of food for the village. Cows were also kept for the meat, milk, and leather they yielded. Sheep were also raised, and transforming their raw wool into cloth was another very important village activity. Much of the year, cloth making was an indoor activity, but during times of good weather, the cloth making procedures moved outside. Women would prepare special plant materials for dye making. And once the wool had been dyed, the next step was to spin it into thread using a spindle. Spinning was a time-consuming activity, but must have been a great relief from the back-breaking work of the fields. After the wool had been spun into thread, villagers often set up their looms on the outside wall of a house, and thus could enjoy the fresh air and sunshine while weaving the thread into warm woolen cloth. Besides making items of cloth, leather, and clay for use in the village, objects of turned wood were also created on these simple machines known as pole lathes. Foot power and the natural spring of a large wooden pole was all that was needed to turn the pieces of wood so they could be shaped into useful objects by a chisel. By the year 600, about 180 years after the village of Stoa was founded, the Anglo-Saxons controlled not just a large part of Britain, but one region of northern Europe as well, while at the same time, other tribes of barbarians had taken over huge areas of land. In the former Roman province of Gaul, another Germanic tribe called the Franks had seized control, and the name of the modern country of France reflects this Frankish heritage. To the southwest, the Ostrogoths had taken over the Iberian Peninsula, and the foundations of modern Spain were laid. And a large portion of Italy was in the hands of another tribe called the Lombards. However, most of the territory bordering the Mediterranean Sea was still part of the Eastern Roman Empire and was ruled from its capital of Constantinople. While Rome, the fallen capital of the Western Roman Empire, was beginning to exert its influence once again, this time as the center of administration for the rapidly growing Roman Catholic Church. During the Dark Ages, three elements were joined together to create an entirely new pattern for Western civilization. These elements were first, the culture of ancient Rome, second, the Germanic peoples and their institutions, and third, and perhaps most important of all, the Christian religion. Christianity had all but disappeared in Britain when the Anglo-Saxons destroyed her Roman civilization. Because the Anglo-Saxons had their own religion, and because they tended to dislike anything that reminded them of the Romans, they did not readily accept the Christian religion. For this reason, Christianity was not successfully reintroduced into Britain until the end of the 6th century. At that time, there were 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain. First, the King of Kent converted to Christianity. Nuns often chose to purify their souls by following lives of penance and solitude, and so to become worthy of entering the kingdom of heaven. The Anglo-Saxon monk named Cuthbert led just such a life. Not long after arriving at Lindisfarne, Cuthbert decided to establish a hermitage for himself on this tiny barren island in the bay just within view of the monastery. Here he lived for some time. But this hermitage was not isolated enough for him, so he moved to a different, more windswept island 7 miles to the south. Here Cuthbert lived a life of prayer, penance, and isolation for 9 years, and during this time is said to have performed many miracles. Whenever the rains and fogs let up, a new